I don't know. Yeah, maybe that must have been.
Yeah, you're trying to talk us out of our ardent sport forever bid law.
I got treated pretty well.
So you've been here a lot of times, a lot of different campaigns. Why don't you start by, I mean, if you have something you want to say up front, we'd love to hear it. But then also, if you want to start with how this one is, you know, is there things that are particularly different this year than past ones?
Well, I think I can sort of do both. If you run for the United States Senate, you run once every 6 years. And it just so happens that I was defeated and I'm running again 6 years later. The amount of change in what people think and focus on in 6 years is dramatic, almost every single time. And so anybody that thinks that the previous election is the guide to what's going to happen in this election, or more importantly, what people think, they're making a big mistake. And that's what happens to a lot of people that are in politics for a long time, is they sort of think that whatever they heard in their first election was the way things are, and that simply isn't true. And so I took an approach in this election that I thought was very important, because I've been in private life for 6 years. I have not been spending all my time trying to go to events around the state. I've enjoyed being in the state, but I have not sort of systematically gone around and done that sort of thing, because I've been doing other things. So I thought what I should do, if I was serious about trying to represent the people of the state, is to basically almost pretend like I hadn't heard anything about the state. I do know a little bit about the state. My family's been here next year 100 years. I know a lot about the state, but that doesn't mean you can really represent the people unless you really intensively listen to them at the time of the election and then going forward. So I went to all 72 counties last year. I went to all 72 counties this year. I've already been to a bunch of them already again. And I don't know if you noticed, but I didn't do, a lot of TV interviews for a long time. I didn't do a lot of op-eds. I wasn't looking for a lot of free press. I went into, starting in May of 2015, a deep dive about what people were thinking. There's a lighthearted side to it, which is the fact that a lot of times you just go into a McDonald's or a diner and there's always this, often the same group of people getting together for coffee. Lane's Bakery, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And, it's so interesting to realize that's such a resource for realizing what people think. So you walk in and they're like, "Hey, Feingold, what are you doing here?" And I go, "Well, I'm running for the Senate." I go, "What are you doing?" "Well, we're here solving the world's problems." And I always say, "How's that going?" And they always say, "We'll let you know when we figure it out." It is wonderful. It's so consistent. In fact, in Sparta, we just weren't even. This is a great example of what we've done. We weren't supposed to be in Sparta. We just were hungry. We were going somewhere else. It was a rainy day. We pulled off the road.
The Norsky Nook or what?
No, come on, John. That's Osseo, Hayward,
I know,
Dane County, and Rice
Lake.
Dane County. Just if you're wondering where those are. So we go in there and we go into the McDonald's, and there's a group of somewhat older guys, and they're across from a car dealership, and they say, "We meet here twice a day." And because it's McDonald's, said the guys at the car dealership across the way here have named us the Arches of Wisdom. So I just love it. Anyway, whether it's that kind of a setting where that's completely spontaneous, whether it's a group of people that have come together to talk, or whether it's in a business or whatever, that created an opportunity to listen to people in all the counties, and there were some very consistent themes. And then this year, when we went to all 72 counties, we did a very similar thing. We also tried to go to an innovative business in almost every county, and that was just a blast. Absolutely fascinating. The kind of innovation, particularly because of the internet, that is occurring in the state. But this is how I think a person should prepare for a campaign, but also if you want to represent people. And there's such a dramatic difference between the attitude about this job between myself and Senator Johnson. I see representation as very different than running a company or being a boss or even running an organization. It's very different. You are the person who is trying to figure out, and if you can, channel the feelings of people into what they really want done. Of course you have to exercise your own judgment, but it's very different than sort of setting the tone. So when people always say to me, "What are my priorities?" I reject the question. I care about a lot of issues, and a lot of people in the state have worked with me on a lot of issues. But the question is, what is the major concern of Wisconsinites? And obviously the answer, as I've said many times, became apparent everywhere in the state, because the way people nodded whenever somebody else said it, it's that working and middle income families can't figure out why they're working hard and they can't pay the bills. And people at the top are doing incredibly well. Wall Street's at an all-time high. Unemployment's relatively low. It's not a panic feeling. It's not always an angry feeling. It's a feeling of frustration. There's some fear. People are very concerned about the stagnation of their wages. They don't understand why people can't get paid family leave like in just about every other country in the world. Tremendous anxiety about prescription medicine costs. It's not just seniors, but especially seniors. I mean, this is a real scary deal for people. It's an element of insecurity, of economic insecurity, that is really quite dramatic. There's probably the single thing in this sort of category that we hear the most is the student loans, college education, technical college education costs, the debt crisis, which truly is a crisis. And again, that's an example of where 6 years ago, 12 years ago, it wasn't at that point. And so if you go out and just let people talk about stuff, you hear that. And then, yes, almost everywhere, people have come to the realization that, frankly, I felt a long time ago, that these corporate handshake trade agreements are a raw deal. And people go, well, you agree with Trump on that. No, Trump didn't say anything about it for a very long time, as far as I know.
Might have been useful in some of those struggles in the past. If he had stood, it might have been useful if he'd stepped up in the past.
Hard for me to think of him as useful. But as you know, I fought Clinton and Gore on NAFTA. I'm against the president's position on TPP. These really are corporate handshakes, and it's amazing. You see even a guy like Steve Radner, who couldn't be more pro-trade on that MSNBC, writing columns saying, we really haven't in any way lived up to the promise we gave to the people who would be dislocated. Senator Johnson loves these agreements. He's voted for all the agreements he could, and now he's playing a little game. I've come out against the TPP, and he said, well, it's just a very long agreement, 6,000 pages. Apparently he was perfectly happy to vote for fast track, despite the fact that he apparently feels that it's been 10 months or 11 months. He's not going to tell us his position on it until after the election. Can you imagine anything more fundamental than the fact that we've lost 75,000 Wisconsin manufacturing jobs from these agreements, and he won't even let the voters know where he stands. We know where he stands. He's for it. He can't wait to vote for it. He calls it creative destruction, but he's playing a politician's game when they are afraid of losing their election. But these are among the things that you hear in this category. Now, as you know, because you've heard me speak, there are other things that I heard that I might not have expected. This was one that I wasn't shocked. I think the consistency shocked me because it was everywhere. But I sort of had a feeling that you'd hear a lot about the economy. But other areas that were just dramatic were infrastructure. Used to be, say the word infrastructure wasn't like a word that was emotional for people. It's becoming emotional. When they talk about the roads, they talk about bridges, 15% of the bridges deemed defective. And people always would say, and what about the rail lines? And water infrastructure. I mean, even if we didn't have dramatic climate change storms and problems, the water infrastructure is antiquated. So this is a major stress. And then the one that sort of knocks it out of the ballpark, though, is the electronic one, which is the most fascinating and disturbing. That there is a story out there about what's happening with the lack of access to fast, high-speed internet for up to 1 million people in this state. And if you get out there, you hear the story. And so I went to Prairie du Chien for just a gathering with a couple of people from the Democratic Party, a couple of business people, a couple other people, and the business guy kicked off the conversation at the beginning of the campaign, saying, we gotta have, I can't compete without this adequate broadband. And then they started telling me the story about students, which I heard everywhere. This is a phenomenon going on all over the state of Wisconsin, and yet a lot of the politicians don't even realize it. And that is, if you live a couple miles outside of town, and I heard this in Prairie du Chien, I heard it in O'Connell Falls, I heard it in Antigo, you leave high school and you go home for dinner. And then you come back in town and you park outside the library or outside the high school or the technical college, and there's a bunch of other cars there. And these kids are not up to no good. like when we used to go to the circuit in Janesville. This is not, you know,
They're doing their homework.
they are just trying to get on Wi-Fi. And, you know, it's such a dramatic difference. And you've heard me talk about this, but I feel very passionate about it. Which is, you know, this whole idea of being able to compete and be educated is a whole different deal when I was growing up in Janesville. You know, in our day, the internet was the World Book, or for fancy families, the Encyclopedia Britannica. So, you know, my mother would say, Rusty, do you have any homework? I'd say, yeah, I got to do a paper on Tunisia tonight. All right. After dinner, you go downstairs, take out tea, get the dust off of it, open it up, there's a paragraph. Copy it over, I'm done. Now you're sitting in that parking lot, you got this little iPhone, and you realize there's 500 articles on Tunisia. You have to learn how to sift and winnow, as the great expression of the University of Wisconsin. But if you can't physically manipulate that, if you can't get it fast, if you can't look at it when you're home at 2 o'clock in the morning or whenever you're crunching for a paper, you can't compete. And so this is one of those great moments where this thing needs to be a utility. This thing has to be guaranteed for everybody in the great Wisconsin tradition. And what it means is breaking up the monopoly. You know, 3 big companies control this. It means national legislation, not to turn it into a government program, as the Republicans would say, but to make sure that other people can compete, such as municipalities, co-ops, and particularly, I like to say, rural electrics. Because, you know, everybody understands what that meant. People couldn't get electricity. This is in the same ballpark. This isn't cable television. This is fundamental. And so, you know, I'm hoping if I'm elected, to work on legislation that would prevent these state overrides in this area. And it's not only a great issue in rural areas, but yeah, you know, they're concerned about this in Racine County. They talk about some areas of the city of Racine where this is an issue as well. So that's a whole area that is huge in terms of people's desire to have things change in a way that should have nothing to do with politics. Another one is water. You know, I joke around about this a little bit, but it's like, you know, our state's like the water state in some ways. You know, our borders are basically, we're bordered by some of the greatest bodies of water in the world. The Mississippi River, St. Croix River, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan. How many places have that? I suppose Florida has more coastline, but it is really dramatic. And I like to tweak our Minnesota friends because they put on their license plate that they have landed 10,000 lakes. We have more, apparently. So when you go out in the state like this, and you're not expecting it, and you hear people in Kewaunee County say, good God, our wells are contaminated here. We're getting brown water in our showers. There was a couple there that had the coolest new coffee and art shop. It was their dream. And I went to see them in Algoma, and we had the most wonderful visit. And a few months later, they had to leave. They moved up to Crandon, up northern Wisconsin, because this water thing was becoming devastating. I attended a meeting of the stakeholders in this thing. It's terrible. You go up to Ashland. Again, I didn't say anything. I went to the Bad River Reservation, met with the mayor of Ashland, met with a couple of county board members. They all said the same thing. They're trying to put a 30,000 hog CAFO up above the 6 watersheds of the Great Lakes Superior. And it is very scary. Bayfield County Board put out a resolution against it. So there's that kind of threat. And then I, even years ago, but even now as well, in places like Adams County and Menominee, over in northwestern Wisconsin, the phenomenon of blue-green algae. These lakes, you know, the dream of many people is, you know, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to get a little cabin on the lake. Well, you go up and look at that lake now, it might not just be bright green, there might be blue in it. And that blue with the green means that a dog goes in there, it's going to die. Good chance it's going to die. A child's going to get sick. In other words, your dream is destroyed. So I see there as being a real problem around the state on these water issues, where there needs to be a partnership between producers, farmers, political officials, advocates, the state government, which of course has been terrible on this stuff. The Walker administration is terrible, and the federal government to address this. I mean, we're talking about roads, we're talking about bridges, we're talking about water. And so, John, those are the kinds of things I've been hearing about.
We passed some pretty restrictive legislation on the Wi-Fi. We turned it all over to
the AT&Ts and Verizons.
That's what we have to override.
Yeah.
Federal law overriding that.
Say, Russ, 6 years ago when you ran against Ron Johnson, you described it to me, we ran into each other somewhere downtown, and you said this is probably the nastiest campaign I've ever experienced. How does this 2016 compare to that? Is it the attack ads, just the nastiness of actually voters? Is it different today? Is there?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of feelings around the country in 2010 that had to do with the fact that the economy had collapsed and that people were told intentional lies about what the Affordable Care Act would do. That helped promote an environment where people were not particularly civil to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But I realize that's part of democracy, and I accepted it. And, frankly, there have been other times when things have been a little harsh as well, but, if you get into this arena, you can't really complain about it.
Right.
So, I try to maintain a civil tone in what I do. People are calling for that. In addition to the economic issues, people would like civility back. They'd like bipartisanship. What I remember in particular in 2010 was if any Republican, if you ever referred to a Republican working with you on a issue, the crowd would say that guy's a rhino, like Lindsey Graham was working with John Kerry on climate change at the time.
Yeah.
And, they passed censure resolutions against him. So I think that's about to change. And, but there was a long period there ever since 2010 where the number one fear of a Republican Senate incumbent was not from a Democrat, but from losing their seat to a right-winger, to a Tea Party, and it happened. Bob Bennett, Dick Lugar, Hatch almost lost his job. I think in this election, that's going to change. I think we're going to do pretty well. And I think what people realize is that not being bipartisan, working with other people will once again be something that matters to the electorate. But we'll see. I certainly hope so, because I hear an awful lot of people saying, is there some way people could start working together again? Of course, that's what I always did.
Well, let's follow on that just for a second, because you were talking about the broadband thing, and Dave referenced it. That would seem like a classic one where you could put together Republicans representing rural areas.
Oh, yeah.
And
Absolutely.
Democrats. It shouldn't be that hard.
Roads, bridges,
and
internet.
Yet, we have tremendous evidence over the last 6-8 years that it is incredibly hard. And in fact, you're running against a guy who, on balance, would say no to that.
Oh, more than that. He signed a letter that would have basically advocated a slower internet. There were 4 senators, there were 4 or 6 senators that signed the letter, and that's just not a request you get a lot. It's like it's really, Russ, could you please slow down the internet a little bit? You just don't hear that. No, he is very extreme on this. As anything that has to do with a corporate position, he always votes with the corporations, almost always. And